Snow falls thick and silent over the Ardennes forest, December 1944. The world has been at war for 5 years, and these ancient trees have witnessed the march of armies since Rome. But on this morning, wrapped in fog and frost, they will witness something new, something that will change warfare forever. A German column moves through the trees, 200 men, maybe more. Their boots crunch on frozen ground, their breath rises in white clouds. They are winning. They can feel it. The Americans are retreating, confused, broken. Victory tastes like winter air. Then, a flicker in the sky, a sound like fabric tearing. The shells arrive, but they do not strike the earth. They burst above the treetops, mid-air, perfectly timed. The snow explodes red. Men drop before they can understand what's happening, before they can dive, before they can pray. The survivors look up and see nothing, just clouds, just sky, just the indifferent winter pressing down on them like a shroud. One word passes through the ranks, whispered in terror. Luftmine. Air mine. Invisible bomb. But that's not what it is. It's something worse. Something they have no name for. They thought they knew war. They had seen 5 years of it, the screaming dive of Stukas, the thunder of 88s, the mechanical roar of panzers crushing earth. They knew how death arrived. They knew its face, its sound, its smell. But in that frozen forest, the Germans met a weapon they couldn't see, couldn't hear, and couldn't understand. A weapon that turned the sky itself against them. A weapon that would break the back of Hitler's last gamble and usher in an age of warfare where the invisible became more deadly than anything you could touch. This is the story of how American science created a ghost and how that ghost saved the world. Adolf Hitler stands over a map in his headquarters, deep in the forests of East Prussia. It is November 1944, and the Führer can feel the walls closing in. The Russians are crushing his armies in the east. The Americans and British are grinding toward Germany's western border. His 1,000-year Reich is dying before it reaches its second decade. But Hitler sees one last chance, one final throw of the dice that might split the Allies, capture their supply ports, and force them to negotiate. He calls it Wacht am Rhein, watch on the Rhine. The Allies will come to know it by another name, the Battle of the Bulge. The plan is audacious, perhaps insane. 3 entire German armies, 250,000 men, hundreds of tanks, thousands of artillery pieces will smash through the weakest point in the Allied line. They will drive through the Ardennes forest in Belgium, cross the Meuse River, and capture the port of Antwerp. The attack will come in winter, when fog and snow will ground Allied aircraft and blind their reconnaissance. Speed and surprise will be everything. Hitler's generals nod, some enthusiastically, others with the quiet resignation of men who have learned not to argue. They have seen what happens to generals who doubt Hitler's vision. But there is something Hitler doesn't know, something none of them know. Hidden in the logistics trains of the American army, sealed in wooden crates marked with the highest security classifications, lies a weapon that will turn his entire strategy into ash. The Americans call it the VT fuse, variable time. But that's a deliberate misdirection, a cover name designed to confuse enemy intelligence. Its real name is the proximity fuse, and it is perhaps the most closely guarded secret of the war, second only to the atomic bomb itself. For now, that secret remains locked away. The fuse has been used at sea, destroying kamikaze planes with devastating efficiency. But it has never been used on land, never been fired where German soldiers might capture an unexploded shell, dissect its mechanism, and understand its terrible elegance. Until now, the risk has been too great. But in December 1944, everything is about to change. The Ardennes region of Belgium is beautiful in a brutal way. Rolling hills covered in thick forest, punctuated by small farming villages, with names that will soon be written in blood. Malmedy, Sonvit, Bastogne. In winter, the forests become a maze of shadows and snow, where visibility drops to meters and the cold seeps through every layer of clothing, every hour of sleep. This is where the Americans have placed some of their greenest troops, the 99th and 106th Infantry Divisions. Men who have barely seen combat hold a 70-mile stretch of front with minimal artillery support. It's supposed to be a quiet sector, a place where new soldiers can get a feel for war without too much risk. Among them are men like Private Thomas McCarthy from Brooklyn, who writes letters home about how boring the front has become, and Lieutenant Robert Hansen, who commands an artillery battery near a place called Elsinborn Ridge, who jokes with his men about getting frostbite before they get battle ribbons. They don't know that across the tree line, hidden in the German positions, 3 armies are coiling like a spring, waiting for the order that will unleash them. The night of December 15th is quiet. Too quiet, some whispered veterans. The forest holds its breath. American sentries stamp their feet in foxholes, blow on their frozen fingers, and stare into darkness so complete it feels solid. At 05:30 on December 16th, that darkness erupts into light. 1,400 German artillery pieces open fire simultaneously. The barrage is apocalyptic. Shells shrieking across the sky, exploding in sequence, walking up and down the American positions with methodical precision. Entire foxholes disappear in geysers of frozen earth. Communication lines are severed in the first minute, command posts collapse, the forest becomes a hell of light and sound and flying steel. Behind the barrage, tanks rumble forward. Panther and Tiger tanks, the best Germany can still produce, their engines growling like mechanical beasts. Infantry follow in their wake, advancing through the smoke and confusion with the confidence of men who believe they are about to change history. And for the first hours, they are right. American positions crumble. Units scatter, retreat, or simply vanish into the fog and chaos. The Germans advance faster than anyone thought possible, overrunning supply depots, capturing prisoners by the hundreds. By midday, they have punched a Bulge, a massive salient 30 miles wide into the American line. In some places, the Americans stand and fight. At Elsinborn Ridge, Lieutenant Hansen's artillery battery receives the order that will define the battle. Hold the ridge, no retreat. The ridge controls the northern shoulder of the German advance. If it falls, the road to Antwerp lies open. Hansen looks at his men. Boys, really, most of them not yet 20. They're scared. He's scared. But they have orders and they have guns, and somewhere behind them supply trucks are bringing up ammunition for a fight that will determine whether Hitler's last gamble succeeds or fails. What Hansen doesn't know, what none of them know, is that mixed among those trucks, hidden among the conventional shells, lies crates marked with red warning labels and coded numbers that only a few officers understand. The weapon is about to arrive, the invisible killer, the sky's secret. And when it does, this battle, this war, this entire shape of warfare will never be the same.
At road junctions and crossroads, small groups of American soldiers try to make stands. Some succeed for an hour, some for minutes. The Germans bypass strong points, drive for the objectives, leave mopping up operations for follow-on units. Speed is everything. Hitler has given them 6 days to reach the Meuse River. After that, Allied reinforcements will arrive, and the window will close. In the village of Malmedy, at a crossroads called Baugny, something happens that will haunt this battle forever. Piper's men capture 84 American prisoners. The prisoners are disarmed, lined up in a snow-covered field. Then German machine guns open fire. The massacre lasts less than 5 minutes. Most of the Americans die instantly. Some survive by playing dead beneath their comrades' bodies, lying in frozen blood until the Germans move on. When the news reaches Allied command, it hardens something in the American response. This is no longer just a battle. It's personal. But for now, in those first chaotic days, the momentum belongs entirely to Germany. By December 17th, the situation is so confused that American commanders can't tell which units still exist and which have been destroyed. Radio communications are sporadic, messengers get lost in the fog. Artillery batteries fire blind, hoping to hit German columns they can hear, but not see. At Elsenborn Ridge, Lieutenant Hansen's battery has been firing continuously for 36 hours. His men are exhausted, their hands blistered and bleeding from handling frozen shells. The barrels of their howitzers are so hot they melt the falling snow, creating strange halos of steam. German infantry probe their positions every few hours, testing for weakness. Each time, American rifle fire drives them back, but everyone knows it's only a matter of time before the tanks arrive. And when the tanks come, artillery positions like Hansen's will be overrun in minutes. Hansen walks along his gun line, checking each position, offering words of encouragement he doesn't feel. One of his gunners, a kid named Daniels from Iowa, looks up at him with hollow eyes. "Lieutenant, we gonna make it?" Hansen doesn't answer right away. He looks out at the fog-shrouded forest, listens to the distant rumble of tanks. Then he lies, because that's what officers do. "Yeah, Daniels, we're gonna make it." That night, a convoy arrives at the ridge. Supply trucks bringing ammunition, rations, medical supplies. Among the conventional high-explosive shells, there are new crates, smaller, heavier, marked with stenciled warnings, handle with extreme care, top secret, authorized personnel only. A major from Ordnance Corps supervises the unloading personally. He gathers Hansen and the other artillery officers for a briefing that lasts less than 5 minutes. "These are VT fuses," the major says, holding up one of the devices. It looks like a standard artillery fuse, the nose cone that screws onto the tip of a shell, but it's different somehow, more complex, with a small glass window and delicate internal components visible beneath. "What's VT stand for?" someone asks. "Variable time." But that's bullshit. It's actually a proximity fuse. It's got a tiny radio inside. When the shell gets close to the ground or close to anything solid, the radio waves bounce back and trigger detonation, automatically, mid-air. The officers stare at him. One of them, a captain named Bradley, speaks what they're all thinking. "Mid-air? You mean like an airburst?" "Exactly like an airburst, except you don't have to calculate it. You don't have to guess range or set timing. It does it itself, every single time." Hansen feels a chill that has nothing to do with the cold. He's seen what airbursts can do, shells exploding above enemy positions, raining shrapnel down on men who thought they were safe in foxholes or behind cover. Airburst is devastating, but it's also incredibly difficult to execute. You need perfect range calculation, perfect timing, perfect conditions. This fuse makes it automatic. "How many we got?" Hansen asks. "Enough. And more coming. Orders from the top. These fuses are now authorized for use on the European front. First time ever on land. You do not, under any circumstances, fire them where they might be captured by the enemy. Only use them on targets that are being overrun or where recovery is impossible." Understood? They understand. This is a weapon so valuable, so secret, that they've been forbidden from using it for fear the Germans might capture one and copy it. But now, with the front collapsing, with Hitler's armies pouring through the Ardennes, someone at the highest levels has decided the risk is worth it. The weapon is about to be unleashed. Hansen returns to his guns and briefs his crews. They handle the new fuses with something approaching reverence, screwing them carefully onto the shells, checking and rechecking connections. The fuses feel fragile, almost delicate. It seems impossible that something so small could change the shape of a battle. But it will. That night, German units continue their advance. They move through the forest in company strength, confident, believing they have the Americans on the run. Some of them are singing old marching songs from the victory years when the Wehrmacht conquered half of Europe and Berlin believed the war would be over by Christmas. They don't know that above them, invisible in the fog and darkness, American artillery crews are tracking their movements, plotting coordinates, loading shells tipped with a secret that weighs less than a pound but carries the future of warfare inside its glass and copper guts. At 0300, Hansen receives the fire mission. German infantry advancing along a forest road, battalion strength, approximately 3,000 yards northeast of his position. Standard counter-battery suppression fire. Except this time, the shells will be different. "Load VT," Hansen orders. His gunners move with practiced efficiency despite their exhaustion. The shells slide into breaches, fuses are armed, gun crews are ready. Fire for effect. The howitzers roar. The shells arc into darkness, invisible against the black sky. Time of flight? 22 seconds. The German column never hears them coming. To understand what happened next, you have to go back to 1940, to a laboratory in Washington, D.C., where a team of scientists were trying to solve an impossible problem. The problem was simple. How do you hit an airplane? In the early years of the war, anti-aircraft gunnery was more hope than science. Gunners would fire shells timed to explode at a certain altitude, creating clouds of shrapnel they hoped enemy aircraft would fly through. Hit rates were abysmal. Sometimes it took thousands of shells to bring down a single plane. The solution seemed obvious: create a shell that could sense when it was near a target and detonate automatically. But how? Mechanical fuses were too crude, too unreliable. Magnetic fuses only worked at very close range. Photoelectric sensors couldn't function in clouds or darkness. Then a team led by physicist Merle Tuve proposed something radical. Put a miniature radio transmitter and receiver inside the nose of an artillery shell. The fuse would constantly broadcast a signal. When that signal bounced back from a nearby object, plane, ground, tank, anything solid, the fuse would detect the echo and trigger detonation automatically.
Radio sets in 1940 were bulky, fragile things the size of suitcases. The notion of building one small enough to fit inside a 3-inch shell, rugged enough to survive being fired from a cannon at accelerations that would pace a human being, and cheap enough to manufacture by the millions, seemed like science fiction. But they did it. They miniaturized the radio. They reinforced the vacuum tubes with special glass. They designed circuits that could survive 15,000 times the force of gravity. They tested thousands of prototypes, had failures, breakthroughs, more failures. They worked 7 days a week, through holidays, through air raid drills, driven by the knowledge that American ships were being sunk by Japanese kamikaze pilots, and American soldiers were dying because artillery couldn't hit what it was aimed at. By 1943, they had a working proximity fuse. It was a miracle of engineering, smaller than a soda can, more complex than anything that had ever been mass-produced, and absolutely lethal. The first combat tests came in the Pacific. American ships defending against kamikaze attacks began using proximity-fused shells. The results were stunning. Hit rates went from 2% to over 30% overnight. Japanese pilots found themselves flying into walls of perfectly timed explosions. Their suicide attacks, which had been devastating, became suicide missions with no chance of success. The secret was kept with paranoid intensity. Every shell fired had to land in water, where the fuse would be destroyed. Strict orders: never use proximity fuses over land, where the enemy might recover an unexploded round. The British wanted to use them over London against V-1 rockets. Denied. Too many duds would fall in occupied France, where Germans could recover them. The fuse was too valuable to risk. If Germany got their hands on one, their scientists might copy it. The advantage would be lost. For 2 years, the proximity fuse remained a naval weapon only, a secret that saved countless American lives at sea while remaining completely unknown on land. Until December 1944, until the Ardennes, until Hitler's last gamble forced Eisenhower's hand. The decision to authorize proximity fuses for land use went to the highest levels. Eisenhower himself approved it, understanding the risk, but understanding more clearly that the battle was slipping away. The fuses were distributed with strict orders. Use them only in situations where German recovery would be impossible. Fire them where the ground was being overrun, where shells would be destroyed by follow-on bombardment, where the tactical necessity outweighed the strategic risk. And so, in the early morning hours of December 17, 1944, proximity fused shells were fired in land combat for the first time in history. The German column moving through the forest road had no warning. Why would they? They were 3 miles behind their own front lines, advancing through territory they'd captured only hours before. They were spread out properly, moving with tactical discipline, doing everything right. The shells arrived traveling faster than sound. The Germans couldn't hear them coming. That's the first thing that made proximity fuses so terrifying. No warning whistle, no time to take cover. Then came the explosions, not on the ground, but 20 meters above it. Perfectly spaced, perfectly timed, creating a ceiling of steel fragments that slice through everything below it. In a traditional artillery barrage, soldiers can take cover, foxholes provide protection, trees and rocks create dead zones where men can survive. But airburst shells eliminate all of that. There is no cover from shrapnel falling from above. Foxholes become death traps. Tree trunks offer no protection. The German column disintegrated. Men fell without understanding why. Officers shouted contradictory orders. Some units tried to scatter into the trees, running directly into follow-on salvos. Others froze in place, paralyzed by confusion. The mathematical precision of the attack was overwhelming. Every shell burst at exactly the right height, every explosion overlapping its neighbors to create a continuous carpet of death. In 6 minutes, the entire battalion was neutralized. 200 men killed, 300 wounded. The survivors stumbled back toward their own lines, shell-shocked, some of them weeping. And the Americans? Hansen's battery had fired fewer than 50 rounds. When the forward observers reported the results, there was stunned silence on the radio. Then someone started laughing, a half-hysterical sound that was part relief and part disbelief. They just destroyed a German battalion with 1 battery, firing for 6 minutes. "What the hell did we just use?" Bradley asked Hansen. Hansen looked at the empty shell casings scattered around his guns, each one still warm. Each one had carried a small miracle of physics and engineering into the night sky. He said, "The future. We just used the future." But for all its technical brilliance, the proximity fuse was still just a tool. What made it truly devastating wasn't the technology. It was how it matched the specific conditions of the Battle of the Bulge. The Ardennes forest provided perfect terrain. Trees everywhere, meaning German soldiers couldn't see incoming shells until they exploded. Dense fog limiting visibility to meters, making it impossible to spot muzzle flashes or calculate firing positions. And, most importantly, the Germans were attacking, moving forward in concentration, presenting exactly the kind of targets that proximity fuses were designed to destroy. Over the next days, as word spread through the American Artillery Corps about the new fuses, more batteries began using them. Not everywhere, supplies were still limited and the security restrictions remained in place. But in critical sectors, on key defensive positions like Elsenborn Ridge and the perimeter around Bastogne, proximity fuses began turning the tide. The Germans still had numerical superiority. They still had better tanks, more experienced infantry, the momentum of their initial breakthrough. But they were learning, attack by attack, advance by advance, that something had changed, that the sky had turned against them in a way they couldn't counter or understand. German intercepts began showing strange patterns. Radio messages reporting new weapon, causes of casualties unknown, medical reports describing wounds consistent with airburst artillery, but noting impossible precision of detonation height. Officers demanding explanations, getting none, becoming increasingly paranoid. Some German units reported Luftminen, air mines. Others called them phantom shells or ghost bombs. Rumors spread of a new American gas weapon, or magnetic bombs that could sense metal, or death rays that exploded shells by remote control. The truth was simpler and more terrifying than any rumor. The Americans had learned to make the sky itself a weapon, and they were just getting started. Oberlieutenant Friedrich Weber commanded a company of the 12th SS Panzer Division. He was 26 years old and had been at war since Poland in 1939. He'd fought in France, Russia, and Normandy. He'd seen friends die in fire and snow, had killed more men than he could count, and had long ago believed in victory. Now he fought only for survival and the men under his command. On December 19th, Weber's company was ordered to advance through a valley south of Elsenborn Ridge. Intelligence reported minimal American presence, light resistance expected. Standard operation. They moved out at dawn. 3 infantry platoons with attached machine gun squads and mortar teams. Around 100 men total, veterans mostly, moving with the practiced efficiency of professional soldiers. The fog was thick enough to touch, turning the world into shades of gray and white. Weber felt uneasy. The valley was too open, too obvious an approach. But orders were orders, and the timetable was absolute. They needed to reach their objectives before American reinforcements arrived.
They'd advanced half a kilometer when the first shells arrived. Weber never heard them coming. That was the thing he remembered later, in the hospital, the thing that haunted his dreams. No whistle, no warning, just sudden light and sound and the feeling of being picked up and thrown like a child's toy.
He came 2 seconds later, ears ringing, face pressed against frozen ground. He tried to stand and realized his left leg wasn't working properly. Blood was seeping through his uniform, warm against the cold air. Around him, the valley had become an abattoir. Bodies lay scattered in the snow, some still moving, some very still. The neat tactical formation they'd maintained had disintegrated. Men were crying out in German, in Polish, and Russian, the hodgepodge of conscripts and volunteers that made up the late war Wehrmacht. The fog was full of smoke and the smell of high explosive and something else, something copper and wrong. Weber tried to understand what had happened. Artillery, obviously, but something about it felt different, wrong. The shells had exploded too high, too perfectly spaced. No craters in the ground. All the damage was to exposed personnel, nothing to cover or equipment. Air burst, his sergeant gasped, crawling over to him. The sergeant's face was peppered with tiny wounds, blood running down his cheeks like tears. Perfect air burst, every single round. That was impossible. Weber knew artillery. Airburst required precise range calculation and fusing. You might achieve it with 1 or 2 rounds through luck and skill, but sustained, repeated, perfect airbursts? That required capabilities the Americans shouldn't have. More shells arrived. This time Weber saw them. Dark shapes falling from the gray sky, almost lazy-looking, deceptively slow. Then they detonated, 20 meters up, each explosion creating a cone of fragments that scythed through anything below. Men who'd survived the first barrage died in the second. There was nowhere to run. The valley walls were too far. Going back meant exposing yourself. Going forward was suicide. They were trapped in a killing zone with an invisible weapon they couldn't fight or understand. Weber tried to give orders, scatter, find cover, anything, but his voice was lost in the screaming and the explosions. His company was dying and there was nothing he could do to stop it. A young soldier, barely 18, crawled over and grabbed Weber's arm. The boy's eyes were wide with terror. "What is it?" he shouted over the noise. "What are they using?" Weber didn't answer because he didn't know. This wasn't war as he understood it. This was something new, something that felt less like combat and more like execution. The barrage lasted 10 minutes. When it finally stopped, Weber's company had ceased to exist as a fighting unit. 60 men dead, 30 wounded, the rest scattered through the forest in ones and twos. Combat effectiveness 0. American infantry never even attacked. They didn't need to. The proximity fuses had done the work. Weber was evacuated that afternoon, carried on a stretcher to a field hospital, then moved further back to a rear area medical station. He survived, though he would walk with a limp for the rest of his life. But he wasn't the same man who'd entered that valley. None of them were. In the hospital, he met other survivors from other units. They all had similar stories, shells that exploded with impossible precision, casualties out of proportion to the barrage size, the sense that they were fighting something they couldn't see or understand. The rumors grew wilder. Some said the Americans had magnetic shells that could sense metal and detonate near tanks. Others claimed it was a form of radar-guided artillery. A few whispered about death rays or experimental gas weapons. German intelligence was baffled. They collected testimony from survivors, analyzed the patterns of American artillery fire, and studied what few shell fragments they could recover from the battlefield. The fragments showed nothing unusual, standard American high-explosive shells. No special mechanisms, no exotic materials. The secret remained hidden inside the fuse itself, that small radio package in the nose cone. And since proximity-fused shells were being used primarily in situations where German recovery was unlikely, intact examples were extraordinarily rare. One German report from late December noted, "Enemy appears to have achieved breakthrough in timed airburst capability, method unknown. Recommend extreme caution when operating in areas under enemy artillery observation." That was the closest German intelligence came to understanding what was happening. They knew the effect, devastating, perfectly timed airbursts, but not the cause. The mechanism remained invisible. And that invisibility was part of what made the weapon so demoralizing. Human beings can adapt to visible threats. You learn to recognize the sound of incoming shells, the whistle that tells you when to dive for cover. You understand that if you're in a foxhole during a barrage, you're relatively safe from ground bursts. You develop techniques, instincts, survival strategies. But proximity fuses eliminated all of that learned behavior. They gave no warning. They made cover meaningless. They created a sense of helplessness that went beyond physical danger into psychological horror. Survivors reported feeling like they were being hunted by something supernatural. The sky had become malevolent, actively trying to kill them. Some men refused to move in the open, even when ordered. Others became catatonic, curled up in foxholes, unable to function. The German advance, which had seemed unstoppable in those first chaotic days, began to slow down. Units took longer to organize attacks. Soldiers hesitated to cross open ground. The momentum, that crucial element of blitzkrieg warfare, started to bleed away. At Elsenborn Ridge, Hansen's battery continued firing day and night. They'd learned to trust the proximity fuses completely, to the point where they could place fire danger close to friendly positions with confidence. The fuses never failed. Every single round performed exactly as designed. One night, a forward observer radioed back coordinates for a German probe that had gotten within 200 meters of American lines. Hansen's crew fired a single salvo, 6 rounds, proximity fused. The German probe evaporated. All 6 shells burst at perfect height, creating overlapping kill zones. When American infantry counterattacked an hour later, they found 18 German bodies and no wounded. The fuses had been that precise, that lethal. Daniels, the young gunner from Iowa, stared at the empty shell casings and spoke what many of them were thinking. "It feels like cheating," he said quietly, "like we're not even fighting fair." Hansen didn't respond right away. He'd been thinking the same thing. The proximity fuse was so effective, so one-sided, that using it felt less like combat and more like murder. The Germans had no counter, no defense, no way to even understand what was killing them. But then he thought about the Malmedy massacre, about American prisoners machine-gunned in a field, about friends who died in the first hours of the offensive, overrun before they could even call for help. "War isn't fair, Daniels," he said finally, "and right now, I'm okay with that." The proximity fuse was changing more than just the tactical situation. It was changing the soldiers who used it. They were becoming accustomed to a level of firepower precision that previous generations couldn't have imagined. They were learning that technology could give them an almost godlike advantage over their enemies. And they were learning that such advantage came with a weight that had nothing to do with the physical heft of shells and fuses. A weight moral, the weight of knowing you could kill efficiently, invisibly, from a distance, without risk or hesitation.
We live in an age of invisible warfare. Drones strike from altitudes where they can't be seen or heard. Cruise missiles navigate by GPS and terrain mapping, finding targets their operators selected hours or days before. Smart artillery shells can change course in flight, guided by laser designators or GPS coordinates. All of it traces back to that winter in the Ardennes, to those scientists who miniaturized a radio and those gunners who fired shells they didn't fully understand, and to those German soldiers who died without knowing what killed them. The proximity fuse was hailed as one of the great inventions of the war. Some military historians rank it second only to the atomic bomb in strategic importance. It saved countless Allied lives by making artillery devastatingly effective. It shortened battles, broke sieges, and turned the tide at critical moments. But it also did something else, something harder to measure but perhaps more important. It taught us that warfare could be conducted at a distance, with precision, with technological advantage so overwhelming that the human element, courage, determination, the willingness to close with the enemy, became secondary to having the better equipment. It taught us that invisibility was the ultimate advantage, that weapons you couldn't see or understand were more demoralizing than anything visible, no matter how powerful. And it taught us that once you unleashed such a weapon, once you showed what technology could do, there was no going back. The future would belong to those who could build smarter weapons, more precise systems, more invisible killers. In the years after the war, American military planners studied the lessons of the proximity fuse intensively.
They saw how a relatively small technological advantage, one that represented less than 1% of shells fired, had produced disproportionate effects on enemy morale, operational capability, and strategic decision-making. They saw the future, and it looked like Elsinborn Ridge. It looked like perfect airbursts, an invisible death, and enemies who couldn't fight what they couldn't see. The arms race of the Cold War, the development of smart weapons in Vietnam, the precision-guided revolution of the Gulf War, the drone warfare of the 21st century, all of it has roots in that snowy forest in 1944, where American gunners first learned to make the sky itself a weapon. We remember the Battle of the Bulge for many things, for the stand at Bastogne and McAuliffe's defiant nuts, for the massacre at Malmedy and the desperate fighting in frozen foxholes, for the courage of young men facing impossible odds in the coldest winter Europe had seen in decades. But perhaps we should also remember it as the moment when warfare crossed a threshold, when technology became more important than tactics, when invisible became more valuable than visible, when the future announced itself not with trumpets or glory, but with the quiet efficiency of a small radio sensing the ground below and triggering a detonation 20 meters up. The Germans never saw it coming. They fought bravely, died honorably, and never understood what killed them. That alone should tell us something about the weapon and the age it ushered in. There's a cemetery in Belgium, near the village of Henri-Chapelle, where over 7,000 American soldiers from the Battle of the Bulge are buried. White crosses in perfect rows stretching across a hillside that overlooks the Ardennes forest. On clear days, you can see for miles. The same forests where German armies advanced and were stopped. The same ridgelines where artillery batteries fired through fog and snow. The same valleys where men died without understanding why. But visitors to this cemetery often comment on how peaceful it is, how quiet. Just wind in the trees and the occasional bird. No indication that this landscape was once hell itself, that these hills echoed with explosions and screams and the mechanical roar of war. But if you stand there long enough, if you listen carefully, you might hear something else, something harder to define. A whisper, perhaps. A memory of the moment when warfare changed forever. The proximity fuse was celebrated as a war-winning weapon. Historians and engineers wrote papers about its development, its deployment, and its effectiveness. The scientists who created it received medals and recognition. The soldiers who used it came home to victory parades and grateful nations. But there was a cost that nobody talked about much. A price that had nothing to do with manufacturing expense or technical trade-offs. The cost was distance. The growing gap between the person who ordered an attack and the person who died in it, between the engineer who designed a weapon and the soldier who faced it, between the theoretical elegance of a radio-triggered fuse and the practical reality of 18-year-old boys dying in snow. The proximity fuse worked too well. It was too effective, too reliable, too easy. Gunners could fire it without seeing their targets. Officers could order barrages without witnessing the results. The killing became abstract, reduced to coordinates and casualty estimates and after-action reports. This was new. Throughout history, warriors had faced their enemies, had seen the faces of the men they killed, had understood viscerally what violence meant. Even with rifles and machine guns and conventional artillery, there was some connection between cause and effect, between action and consequence. But the proximity fuse began to sever that connection. It made killing efficient, distant, almost sterile. You loaded a shell, pulled a lanyard, and somewhere beyond the horizon, people died. You never saw them, never heard them, never had to confront what your technology had done. And this was just the beginning. In the decades that followed, that distance would grow. Pilots would drop bombs from 30,000 feet, watching targets disappear in smoke through bomb sights and cameras. Naval officers would launch cruise missiles at targets hundreds of miles away, never leaving their ships. Drone operators would sit in air-conditioned trailers in Nevada, destroying targets in Afghanistan with joysticks and computer screens. The proximity fuse showed us the path. It demonstrated that technological advantage could substitute for tactical skill, that invisible weapons were more effective than visible ones, and that distance, physical, emotional, moral, could be an asset rather than a limitation. Today, we debate the ethics of autonomous weapons, of AI systems that can identify and engage targets without human intervention, of weapons that kill based on algorithms and sensor data and pre-programmed parameters. But that debate really started in December 1944, in the Ardennes, when we first fired a weapon that could sense its target and destroy it automatically, without human judgment in the final moment. The scientists who designed the proximity fuse were not evil men. They were brilliant, dedicated, working desperately to save lives and win a war against genuine evil. The soldiers who used it were not monsters. They were young men trying to survive, trying to protect their friends, trying to go home. But in creating and using that weapon, they opened a door that can never be closed. They showed us that warfare could be conducted at a distance, with precision, with technological advantage so overwhelming that the human element, courage, determination, the willingness to close with the enemy became secondary to having the better equipment. It taught us that invisibility was the ultimate advantage, that weapons you couldn't see or understand were more demoralizing than anything visible, no matter how powerful. And it taught us that once you unleashed such a weapon, once you showed what technology could do, there was no going back. The future would belong to those who could build smarter weapons, more precise systems, more invisible killers. There's a recording from 1946, part of an oral history project, where one of the scientists who worked on the proximity fuse was asked if he had any regrets about his work.
In that snow-covered valley, in those frozen forests, the future of warfare was being born, not with triumph or glory, but with efficiency and silence and the terrible effectiveness of machines doing what they were designed to do. The sky had turned, and beneath it, men on both sides were learning what that meant. By December 23rd, the German offensive had stalled, not collapsed. Hitler's armies were still dangerous, still fighting with desperate skill, but stalled. The momentum had drained away like blood into snow. At Elsenborn Ridge, the line held. Despite repeated German attacks, despite armor and artillery and the veteran infantry of the SS, the Americans held their ground. The proximity fuse wasn't the only reason. Courage, determination, and conventional artillery played their parts, but it was a crucial factor. Every German attack that tried to mass for a breakthrough ran into perfectly timed airbursts that shredded formations before they could develop. Further south, at Bastogne, another drama was unfolding. The 101st Airborne, surrounded and outnumbered, was holding the vital crossroads town against everything the Germans could throw at them. When the German commander sent a surrender demand, Brigadier General McAuliffe replied with a single word: nuts. But being surrounded meant limited artillery support until the weather cleared. On December 23rd, the fog finally lifted. For the first time in a week, the sun broke through the clouds. American fighter bombers took to the air in swarms, attacking German columns that had been invisible and invulnerable under the cloud cover. At the same time, C-47 transport aircraft began dropping supplies to the trapped paratroopers in Bastogne. Among those supplies, ammunition for the 105mm howitzers defending the perimeter.
and mixed with the standard high-explosive rounds were crates of proximity-fused shells. The defenders of Bastogne had been rationing ammunition, sometimes going hours without firing to preserve shells for critical moments. Now, they had a new capability that transformed the defensive equation. German attacks that had been merely dangerous became suicidal. On December 26th, Patton's Third Army broke through from the south and relieved Bastogne. The siege was over. The German offensive, for all practical purposes, was finished. But the fighting continued through January as the Allies pushed the Bulge back, recapturing lost ground, driving the Germans back to their start lines and beyond. And throughout those weeks, proximity fuses continued their work, invisible and relentless. The statistics tell part of the story. American artillery fired approximately 18 million rounds during the Battle of the Bulge. Roughly 200,000 of those, just over 1%, were proximity fused. But casualty reports suggest that those 200,000 rounds accounted for nearly 20% of German casualties from artillery fire. 1% of shells, 20% of casualties. The math was stark and unforgiving. German after-action reports, when they could be compiled, showed a pattern of units being destroyed before they could engage, of attacks disrupted before they could develop, of defenses overcome by fire they couldn't see or counter. The proximity fuse had become a ghost haunting every operation, every movement, every attempt to mass forces for an attack. By mid-January, when the Bulge had been reduced and German forces pushed back across the frontier, Allied intelligence began intercepting German radio messages, showing acute awareness that something had fundamentally changed in the artillery battle. One message sent from a corps commander to his divisional units warned, "Enemy possesses artillery capability of unknown type, resulting in excessive casualties during movement and concentration. Recommend dispersal and night movement only." But it was too late for recommendations. The damage was done not just to German forces in the Ardennes, but to German strategic capability overall. The Wehrmacht had gambled everything on the winter offensive. They'd committed their last reserves, their newest tanks, their most experienced units, and they'd been stopped, not just by American courage or Allied numbers, but by a weapon most of them never understood. Lieutenant Hansen's battery remained on Elsenborn Ridge through January. They'd fired over 4,000 rounds during the battle, more than 300 of them with proximity fuses. His guns had become one of the most effective artillery positions in the entire battle, destroying estimated 15 German companies and disrupting countless other operations. Hansen himself was recommended for a Bronze Star. He never wore it much. Years later, when asked about the battle, he would describe it in technical terms: fire missions, coordinate calculations, ammunition expenditure rates. He rarely mentioned the proximity fuses, even after they were declassified. Some things, he said, you didn't brag about. Daniels, the young gunner from Iowa, went home in 1945 and never spoke about the war. His children would later say he kept a small piece of metal in his desk drawer, a fragment from a proximity fuse casing. He never explained what it was or why he kept it. And Oberleutnant Weber, recovering in a German hospital, would spend the rest of his life trying to understand what had happened in that valley. He became an engineer after the war, studied radio technology, and eventually read about the American proximity fuse in a technical journal in 1953. He sat in his study for a long time after finishing the article, remembering the snow and the explosions and the feeling of fighting something invisible. "So that's what it was," he said to his wife, all those years wondering. It was just radio waves, just physics. But it wasn't just physics. It was never just physics. The Battle of the Bulge cost over 80,000 American casualties and an estimated 100,000 German casualties. It was the largest and bloodiest single battle fought by the United States in World War II. And while no single weapon won or lost that battle, the proximity fuse represented something profound. the moment when technological advantage became so overwhelming that courage and skill and experience couldn't overcome it. The Germans fought brilliantly. Their tactics were sound, their soldiers brave, their determination absolute. But they were fighting an enemy they couldn't see, using methods they couldn't counter, against a weapon they couldn't even comprehend. In that frozen forest, in those desperate weeks of December and January, the nature of warfare changed. Not with a dramatic moment or a single decisive battle, but gradually, shell by shell, as American gunners learned to trust their new fuses and German soldiers learned to fear the sky. The proximity fuse went on to be used throughout the rest of the war. In the Pacific, it devastated Japanese infantry attacks. In the final drive into Germany, it broke apart defensive positions that might have held for weeks. By war end, over 22 million proximity fuses had been manufactured, an industrial achievement rivaling the atomic bomb in complexity and expense. After the war, the fuse was declassified. The secret that had been guarded so jealously became public knowledge. Engineers around the world studied it, improved it, adapted it. The basic principle, a small radio that could sense proximity and trigger detonation, became fundamental to modern weapons design. Today, nearly every guided missile, smart bomb, and advanced munition uses descendants of that original proximity fuse. The technology has evolved. Radar has replaced radio, computers have replaced vacuum tubes, digital processing has replaced analog circuits, but the core concept remains the same. Weapons that can sense their targets and react automatically, without human intervention in the final moment of impact.
He thought for a long time before answering. "We built something that saved lives," he said finally. "American lives. That was the goal. We achieved it. But sometimes I wonder, we made killing so efficient, so easy, that it stopped feeling like killing. It became engineering, mathematics, problem solving. And I'm not sure that's a good thing, even for a good cause." The interviewer asked what he meant. "I mean that once you take the human difficulty out of violence, once you make it as simple as pulling a trigger or pushing a button, you've changed something fundamental about what it means to be human. You've made it too easy to forget that targets are people, that numbers in a casualty report were somebody's son or father or friend." He paused. "We saved lives, I believe that. But we also opened Pandora's box, and I don't think anyone knows how to close it." In the Ardennes forest, on winter days when the snow falls thick and silent, the trees still stand where they stood in 1944. They've grown taller, thicker, but they remember. They witnessed the moment when the sky turned against men, when invisible death rained down from clouds, when technology became terror. The soldiers are gone now. Hansen and Daniels and Weber and all the others, the last veterans of that battle, have passed into history. Soon, no one alive will remember what it felt like to be there, to hear those shells burst overhead, to understand that something had changed forever. But the weapon remains. Not the physical proximity fuse, those are museum pieces now, obsolete relics of an earlier age. The concept remains, the principle, the idea that weapons should be smart, invisible, capable of killing without human intervention in the final moment. We are the inheritors of what was born in that forest. Every smart bomb, every guided missile, every autonomous system traces its lineage back to that winter when American scientists miniaturized a radio and put it inside an artillery shell. And the question we have to ask ourselves, the question we've been avoiding for 80 years, is simple and terrible. Just because we can make weapons invisible, efficient, and precise, should we? The Germans never saw it coming. They died without understanding what killed them, without even the dignity of facing their enemy or comprehending their defeat. And neither did we. Neither did we. We didn't see that in solving one problem, how to make artillery more effective, we were creating another. how to live with weapons so powerful and so distant that using them requires no courage, no risk, no moment of recognition that what you're destroying is human. The Battle of the Bulge ended in January 1945. The proximity fuse was declared one of the great successes of the war. And somewhere in that frozen forest, the future was born. Invisible, efficient, and utterly without mercy. The sky had turned, and it has never turned back. In that transformation lies both our triumph and our tragedy. We learned to make weapons that could kill with perfect precision from perfect distance with perfect efficiency. We learned to wage war without seeing it, without feeling it, without bearing its weight in any meaningful way. And in learning that, we may have lost something essential about what it means to be human. Something about the weight of violence, the cost of killing, the moral gravity of taking life. The proximity fuse saved countless lives in World War II. This is true and important and should never be forgotten. But it also taught us that killing could be easy, and that lesson, once learned, can never be unlearned. The weapon they never saw coming wasn't just a fuse or a shell or a technological innovation. It was the future, our future, the one we're still living in. The one where warfare is conducted by sensors and algorithms, where enemies die at distances measured in miles or continents, where the connection between cause and effect has been so completely severed that we can wage war without ever confronting what war actually means. In the Ardennes, in December 1944, under snow and fog and the indifferent winter sky, that future announced itself. Not with trumpets or glory, but with the quiet efficiency of a small radio sensing the earth below and triggering a detonation 20 meters up. The Germans never saw it coming. Neither did we. And perhaps that's the real story. Not just what the proximity fuse did in that battle, but what it did to us. How it changed not just warfare, but our relationship to violence itself. How it made us comfortable with invisible killing, with distant death, with technology that eliminates the last traces of human connection from the act of taking life. The weapon they never saw coming wasn't just killing Germans in the Ardennes. It was killing something in ourselves. Some last connection between action and consequence, between power and responsibility, between the finger on the trigger and the body in the snow. And that weapon, unlike the proximity fuse, has never been declassified, has never been understood, has never been fully reckoned with. It's still out there, still invisible, still killing in ways we don't quite see or understand. The sky turned in December 1944, and it is still turning now.